Birds aren't real, and neither are Chinese airplanes.
Gabby, what are you doing?
Your intro. Anyway, this is Takui with the History of Everything podcast.
Gabby!
Okay, yeah, now that that's out of the way, China appears to have tested a new 6th generation stealth military aircraft, which is not a bird. Though at the same time, they now do also have birds that are drones, so yeah, that is actually a thing. Yes, my friends, the internet has been abuzz as videos of these brand new warplanes went viral all across social media. Or at least when I say that, varying different social medias as well as media sources have been going wild about it for the last, well, couple weeks at this point, I think. I guess it really depends on when this video actually gets released at the time that I'm making it, which is the beginning of January, and this whole thing was happening in the middle of like December. Yes, my friends, mysterious tailless aircraft were seen flying over Chengdu City in southwest Sichuan province, though the defense ministry hasn't really confirmed what exactly anything is, and that's something that I feel like over the course of this video I'm going to be mentioning several times. We do not actually know what these things are precisely. We know that they are jets, and both of them are tailless, meaning that they don't have vertical stabilizers to help maintain control. And for anyone who is curious, this type of aircraft are things that are typically kept stable by computers that go and interpret the pilot's control inputs, and then they make it extremely difficult to actually detect. This is a very advanced form of aircraft. As for why any of this was happening, it doesn't really appear to have been a coincidence. The test flight would go and coincide with the birth anniversary of Mao Zedong, who, for anyone who has seen anything that I previously covered before, that is the founder of the People's Republic of China. That is the original communist overlord of the state. But still then, what exactly are they? Well, when going and looking at the actual physical description of these things, or at least what is kind of visible, the larger of the two designs is kind of diamond-shaped, with 3 air intakes for its engines, 2 alongside the fuselage, and 1 on top, which is, I have to say here right from the very get-go, that is not how things are typically designed when it comes to jets. That's a very unusual configuration. The smaller one is something that looks a little bit more like the conventional layout of what we would expect with a jet, except at the same time, it does not have a tail. What is interesting to note is that both of these things really seem to look like a leaf. They both lack the 90-degree angles that typically you would see with stealth shaping for reduced radar detection. But from what it is that we have seen, both of these planes appear to be closer to fighters rather than bombers or some other type of plane. We really don't know precisely what they are, but this appears to be what they are. But as for how advanced these things actually are, as one Chinese aerospace observer and author, Andreas Ruprecht, would go and say, quote, using the 6th generation description is perhaps a little too hasty, but I think we are at the point where we can really say that the Chinese have shown us for the first time their idea of air combat and new generation fighters. End quote. And my friends, when I go and describe all of this, this is a very important thing that I really want to focus on for the history part of this video, which is, where we actually do things here on the History of Everything podcast. We're going to be using this term quite a bit over the course of it, but we've mentioned 6th generation fighter quite a bit, and that is something that is being thrown all around social media. But the majority of people do not actually know what a X generation fighter is. Like, yes, okay, 6th gen means newer and better than 5th gen, right? Well, yeah, maybe. No, not necessarily. Look, it's really hard to say because the reality is there is not actually a confirmed consensus on what the generations are of aircraft in the first place. So the sheer amount of panic of what is going on in social media is extra confusing because the majority of people have no idea what it is that they are even talking about in the first place. And as such, this is going to require a little bit of an explanation so that people actually understand things. So buckle up, my friends, strap in, and prepare to take off for the weird geopolitical history of fighters, the codpiece measuring contest of the global superpowers for the past several decades. Well, speaking of terrible events and injuries, oh dear God, is this a segue? This video, in the most ironic way possible, is sponsored by Morgan & Morgan. Yes, the law firm. And you actually do not understand how ironic this is. You see, my friends, just a couple days ago, I was in an accident, and this is my car. When we stopped at a red light, a pickup truck that was behind us failed to stop because apparently the person got a piece of blender stuck underneath their brake, which, no, I'm not kidding about that, and then proceeded to ram us from behind at full speed. Now, luckily, at the time of the accident, there was no severe injury, but since then, there has been some consistent lasting bodily pains. Depending on how all of this goes for me, Morgan & Morgan could be seriously useful right now. Because look, when you're seriously hurt, your injury could actually be worth millions. Because look, Morgan & Morgan doesn't settle for lowball offers. They've achieved significant verdicts in the past couple of months for victims involved in life-altering car crashes, with one $12 million case in Florida and another $26 million case in Philadelphia. What's awesome is that the fee is absolutely free unless it is that you win. So look, if you ever got seriously injured, your case, as I said, could be worth millions.
And thus, you could be only a few clicks away from actually changing your life. If any of this is relevant to you, you can go and click my link down in the description below and go to www.forthepeople.com/historyofelverything.
First off, my friends, the notion of aircraft generations is really only a term that applies to just jets, rather than the propeller-driven fighter aircraft that we would see from World War II and then previously World War I. This is something that, even though we have this description of it, of generations, that really didn't appear until going into the 1990s, as we were at that point trying to make sense of the leapfrogging improvements in performance to jet fighters that, oh dear God, the amount of advancements that aircraft saw over the course of just a short time frame here is truly insane, and that is why they had to try and classify things. I mean, we're talking about major advances in aircraft design, avionics, weapon systems, and so much more, which makes it kind of difficult to understand for a lot of people as to what is better or newer than what you previously had. The difficult thing, for the most part, was actually going and determining, okay, what constitutes a generational shift? What is something that is going to differ between generation 1, 2, and 3 that actually classifies it as generation 1, 2, or 3? Well, a generational shift in jet fighter aircraft typically occurs, or at least this is what we think of it occurring, when a technological innovation cannot be incorporated into an existing aircraft through upgrades and retrospective fit-outs. Basically, if you have the frame of an airplane and you cannot upgrade it anymore with new pieces of technology that would make it comparable with other new aircraft that are coming out, then at that point, that is part of a set generation and a whole new generation of aircraft are needed, with those pieces of technology incorporated into it from the very get-go. Is that a messy way to explain things? Yes. Oh dear God, it is. But the really confusing thing, though, is that different authorities have identified different technology jumps as being the key ones that would divide fighter development into different numbers of generations. Generally speaking, 5 generations are now widely recognized, with the development of a 6th generation being underway by many different countries, but authorities don't exactly agree with each other about whether a set jet falls into the category of Generation 4, or 5, or even 4.5, as some have actually said. Look, if this sounds confusing from the beginning, I am sorry, that is the reality of modern day technology. It just is. Animarchy TV, if you're seeing this video, I will bow to your judgment and authority when I inevitably end up mixing up half a dozen different sub-variants of a fighter and their experimental stages because, oh dear God, was this a nightmare to sort through. Look, just as an example of what it is that I am talking about, allow me to pull up Wikipedia, which, yes, I know, yeah, Wikipedia, it's not a great source, obviously, but it does have a very good chart that specifically shows a number of different authorities and what they classify, certain jets as. When we put this thing up here, notice how varied these interpretations are, with some things being classified as only 2nd generation fighters, while other systems classify them as 4th generation. Yeah, that is a really big jump. Okay, so this then brings up the question then of what exactly are the generations of fighters? Keep in mind, when I go and explain this, I will be using broad and general terms. So to those that get very specifically angry about tanks, planes, and other vehicles, you have been warned, and I already know what the comment section is going to look like, but yeah, that's the reality that we're going to have to face. To start off with, we have the earliest jet fighters. Those are the first generation that appeared during and after the last years of World War II. Now, these things were similar, at least in most cases, to the piston engine contemporaries that existed at that same time, having straight, effectively unswept wings, and also being made of either wood or light alloy construction. Yeah, for those of you that are curious about jets being made out of wood, that was a thing that the Germans did try to do because, unfortunately for them, they really started to run out of resources towards the end. In fact, my friends, when we go and talk about this, the first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262, was not really operational until 1944. And by that point, its effectiveness had been utterly crippled, both by the deteriorating infrastructure of Nazi Germany, as well as the advanced materials needed for its engines being in short supply, and fuel was practically non-existent at that point. So were they awesome? Yeah, they were really effective, but at the same time, produced in such small numbers and with such limited fuel capacity that they really couldn't do all that much. The United States, as well as the UK, also had jet fighters that were operational before the end of the war, technically speaking, but they saw very little use. The British Gloucester Meteor twin-engine high-speed fighter was used to intercept German V-1 flying bomb missiles over the British Isles, and it was not deployed for combat over Europe until 1945. In comparison, the Americans had the Lockheed P-80, which would enter service in the closing phases of the war and was deployed to Europe, but by the time it actually arrived there, it was way too late for any combat to ever be seen. It wasn't really used. Of course, the war ending did not stop the developments of jets, as afterwards the Cold War would begin and an arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States would take place for basically the next half century, which would see a number of different developments. The introduction of swept wings would allow transonic speeds to be reached, but at the same time for these early jets, they weren't necessarily very controllable, especially at high speeds. As such, these aircraft were typically aimed at being air superiority interceptors, essentially aircraft meant to take out enemy aircraft quickly and at high speeds. From here, the fighters heading into the late 40s going into the early 50s, such as the F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15 and MiG-17, these were things that what we would truly classify as the beginning of the post-war first-generation fighters. These had basic avionic systems, with no real radars or self-protection countermeasures or anything like that, and not to mention that these first-generation things were armed in pretty much the same way that the previous pistoned engine things had been, with machine guns or cannons, as well as unguided bombs and rockets. Along with this, one of the common characteristics that you could say this generation of fighters had was that the jet engines did not have afterburners, and so the aircraft would operate in the subsonic region. While yes, these jets were a huge leap from the propeller planes of the previous decade, simultaneously they ran very quickly into a series of major problems. Each other. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 demonstrated just how effective these new aircraft could be against, well, each other, but also at the same time how hard it was for them to actually be dealt with. Machine guns and cannons proved to be extremely unreliable at very high speeds for dogfighting, while at the same time troops on the ground needed smarter air support that would not just blow right past them, missing everything with their insane speed. And so that, my friends, then brings us to what we would classify as the second generation of jet fighters, this being from the mid-1950s all the way to the early 1960s. The second generation of fighters would see the introduction of air-to-air radar, infrared, and semi-active guided missiles, as well as radar warning receivers into such aircraft as the F-5, the F-104 Starfighter for the Americans, the Soviet MiG-19 and MiG-21, the British Electric Lightning, and the French Dassault Mirage 3, though there's again kind of contention as to whether or not that plane with the French is second generation or third generation, and it gets messy. Okay, it's messy. This generation of fighters would also see immense advances in engine design as well as aerodynamics, which would allow them to not only reach, but sustain supersonic speeds in level flight. They could continuously fly at these speeds that never before had been able to be reached. And look, I've kind of already mentioned it, but what I really need to talk about here at this point is that there is not a clearly defined line between first and second generation fighters. And some early second gen fighters, such as the F-8 Crusader, still had guns as their primary armament. And at the same time, when you consider that infrared-guided or heat-seeking missiles such as the AIM-9 Sidewinder or the early beam-riding missiles like the Kaliningrad K-5 were also used on late first-gen aircraft, it ends up muddying things, because now you have a first-gen aircraft that is capable of taking on second-gen aircraft, but it pretty much becomes a second-gen aircraft because of what it's capable of doing. In short, it gets really confusing. During this period, although air-to-air combat was still technically speaking within visual range, like you still technically should have been able to see the thing that you were shooting at, radar-guided missiles started to extend just how far engagement ranges were, to the point that from second to third gen, you did not see the enemy fighters that you were going after anymore. Which that, right there, is what we are then going to jump into next. We have the third generation of jet fighters, which typically ran from the early 1960s all the way to 1970. As you can imagine from what I've already mentioned, we are talking about aircraft that saw extensive use over the course of the Vietnam War. With so many years of conflict, developments are bound to be made to counter enemy developments, and vice versa. This generation would witness vast improvements in maneuverability, and significant advancements to avionics and weapon systems. Not only that, but this is where we really start to see something interesting. Many third generation fighters were designed not just to be fighters or interceptors or anything like that. No, instead they were supposed to have multi-role capabilities. Not every single one, but this is where it started to become more commonplace. Aircraft at this time were expected to carry a wide range of weapons for different purposes. We are talking about things such as air-to-ground missiles, air-to-air missiles, laser-guided bombs, and so much more. Considering what these things were being used for, the aircraft needed to be able to support troops on the ground, while at the same time being able to take out enemy aircraft that were far outside of visual range using semi-active guided radio frequency missiles like the AIM-7 Sparrow and the AA-7 Apex. This generation of fighters would also at the same time bring forth numerous different improvements in supporting avionics, including pulse Doppler radar, off-site targeting, and terrain warning systems. Not everything was perfect or worked well necessarily, but they were still huge advances. And types such as the American McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom, the Soviet MiG-23, the Sukhoi Su-17, the Chinese Shenyang J-8, and the British Hawker Siddeley Harrier could all be a part of this group of third-gen aircraft and would work to varying different degrees. But as I said, it didn't necessarily work every time, and the reality was the third generation was a time of experimentation, and mostly worked to support the much more reliable and way better fighters of the fourth generation that you would see from the 1970s heading into the late 1980s. And again, my friends, when I go and describe this is where I need to clarify something else. The term 4th gen and 5th gen can oftentimes be used interchangeably by so many different planes because this is the point where we also get introduced to the generation of 4.5. And so depending upon what kind of service or authority you're going to when describing these things, you're going to have completely different generations go and describe it. Old planes were oftentimes updated with newer and better tech, as computers would experience rapid growth and development over the course of the 80s heading into the 90s. You see, through the 1970s and 1980s, the trend of improvement in avionics, such as heads-up displays and optimized aerodynamic design, would continue with the development of the fly-by-wire system, with fighters such as the MiG-29, Su-27, FA-18, F-15, F-16, and Mirage 2000 all coming into play. The thing that is very interesting and to take note of here is that long-range air-to-air missiles were originally thought to make dogfighting obsolete, that wasn't going to happen anymore because you were able to shoot your enemy so far outside of visual range that dogfighting was pointless. But as time went on, that didn't really end up happening. The reason for this is that as time went on and aircraft became more advanced, they were able to confuse or outmaneuver a number of different missiles or weapons that were placed against them. This then placed a renewed emphasis on maneuverability being key for jets because they actually needed to be able to dodge things. At the same time that is going on, meanwhile, the growing cost of military aircraft in general and the demonstrated success of aircraft such as the F-4 Phantom, this would further increase the popularity of multi-role fighters, and that is the emphasis that most air forces would place themselves on. After all, why pay for 100 of each type of aircraft when you could just have 100 that do everything? And with the millions and millions of dollars that these things cost, that just seemed to be a way more realistic and viable option than just trying to get one of everything. So it is then, my friends, that this focus on cost is then what brings us to Generation 4.5. It sounds confusing when people first hear it, but the explanation is something that really does make sense. You see, my friends, the concept of having a half generation stemmed from a forced reduction in military spending, even as computer technology was rapidly evolving over the course of the 90s. It became significantly more cost-effective to add stealth radar absorbent materials, thrust vector controlled engines, greater weapons carriage capacity, and to extend the range of 4th gen fighters, such as the Hornet, Eagle, and Flanker, than to design an entire new aircraft by itself. As just one example of a 4.5 generation fighter that was evolved from a 4th generation aircraft, you have the FA-18EF Super Hornet. The addition of an active electronically scanned array, or AESA radar, this was a significant enough game-changing combat capability for these redesigned fighters to be deemed a generation of their own. Hence, the whole 4.5 rating. Along with this, some manufacturers would go and design new platforms, such as the Eurofighter Typhoon, the Saab JAS-39 Gripen, and others, which would incorporate many of the Generation 4.5 advanced characteristics into their own new plane. For further clarification on what exactly it is that I am talking about here, as I know it's still something that is going to confuse a number of people, the United States government technically defines 4.5 generation fighter aircraft as 4th generation jet fighters that, quote, have been upgraded with AESA radar, high capacity data link, enhanced avionics, and the ability to deploy current and reasonably foreseeable advanced armaments, end quote. This is all well and good and would serve as a great stopgap measure between Generation 4 and 5 to update many different aircraft, but ultimately, in the end, there would be a jump to 5th generation aircraft, and that is where, technically speaking, we have been to this very day in 2025. To explain, and again, mind you, this can be very confusing, a 5th generation fighter includes major technologies developed during the first part of the 21st century, with a specific emphasis on stealth. So when people talk about stealth fighters, they are typically referring to 5th generation aircraft, as these are the big game changers that would determine any kind of modern conflict. As of 2025, these are the most advanced fighters in operation used in active war zones, barring, whatever experiments are taking place in the US as well as China. Now, the characteristics of a 5th generation fighter are not universally agreed upon, which, I know, how surprising, especially with everything that I've already said over the course of this video. Yeah, and not every 5th generation type necessarily has every single feature. However, they all typically include stealth, or at least a degree of stealth, with some being more stealthy than others. Generally speaking, they also have low probability of intercept radar, LPIR, agile airframes with supercruise performance, meaning that they can sustain supersonic speeds for general cruising. They have advanced avionics and highly integrated computer systems that are capable of networking with other elements within the battle space, command, control, and communications capabilities. There's a lot of military terminology that's going to be thrown into here, so I apologize if that is confusing for anyone. Now, when I go and talk about this, for the past several decades, the United States has been the one that has been at the forefront of jet technology and really was the driving force behind 5th gen aircraft. In 2005, the first operational 5th generation fighter jet was the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor, which was introduced by the US Air Force. It is an air superiority, supersonic, highly maneuverable stealth featuring fighter equipped with state-of-the-art weapons and electronics. It also had supercruise at Mach 1.8, which means it was capable of flying at Mach 1.8 without the use of afterburners. And mind you, when I go and talk about this thing was so valuable that even to this very day, the F-22 has never been sold to another country. Yes, it has been used in other countries, but it has been used in other countries by American forces. There is no other foreign government that actually owns any F-22s. This is something that is packed with classified technology, including stealth capabilities, advanced avionics, and very powerful engines. It is simply too valuable. The US could not risk potentially losing this technology to espionage or something else that would allow an enemy state to increase its own air superiority capabilities. And so, the F-22 has been kept at home. Which, mind you, when I go and describe this, it's not necessarily like any other country would have an easy time getting one in the first place, even if it was allowed, because the F-22 is one of the most expensive fighter aircraft ever produced. We're talking like over $150 million per unit. At one point, the US government was actually looking at, what would it cost to actually be able to sell and give these fighters to other countries? And so back in 2021, there was a US Air Force document that estimated that an export program, which would have allowed other countries to go and use the F-22 to actually potentially buy them, I guess, this could have cost up to $13 billion. So really, it's just not economical to give these fighters to others anyway. But either way, the US, again, has been at the forefront of this technology, and arguably the primary competitors to the USA for the past couple decades has been China and Russia, or at least that was the claim. From 2005, for over a decade, there really was nothing that could compare to the F-22s. They were the kings of the sky, until the Chinese would launch the J-20, and later the Russians would launch the Su-57. But that last one, I should say here, has been a bit controversial, to say the least. Like, I'm saying this right now, but the Su-57 probably deserves its own video, as it has been used as both a massive propaganda tool for the Russians and simultaneously something that has been mocked even by Russia's allies like the Chinese. And Amarki TV, if you see this video, this might be a great collaboration between the two of us. Anyway, disregarding the Russians, for years now, the big competition in air has been between the USA and China. both fielding impressive air fleets of F-22s and J-20s, as well as the newer F-35s and J-35s. It really does seem that for every plane the United States makes, the Chinese, for years, have been able to develop some form of copy or another that appears a couple years later. The key difference for the last 20 years or so is that the USA have actually used its planes more extensively for combat, real combat, than just simple tests, allowing it to work out more of the possible kinks that could be there, which does give an edge in at least experience, even if on paper some of the J-20 aspects appear to be more impressive than the F-22s. So really, there is a debate that could be had there, but it's not my place to necessarily say what is what. Either way, it is now that the world is abuzz with the possibility that things may be changing again with the idea of a sixth generation aircraft. Now, what is interesting to note is that there already appears to have been some kind of small economic effect, as the stock of the US arms firm Lockheed Martin, which is the maker of the F-35 5th-gen jet, was downgraded to hold from buy status by Deutsche Bank with a price target of $523, down from $611. People really seem to have been spooked at the bank after videos of the new 6th-gen Chinese aircraft emerged, which I will go ahead and say here right now, that seems very odd because you would think, oh hey, China just unveiled a new aircraft. Looks like a blank check is about to be written to the American arms industry. You'd think that the stock would actually go up at that time. But that's my own personal opinion, just interjected right there. When I go and describe this, neither the Chinese military nor the Chinese defense industry, as I already said, has verified the videos or photos or made really any kind of official announcement on the aircraft as of the time that I'm making this. There is really not any information out there, verified or unverified, about what is happening. And that, in and of itself, is probably one of the things that has people on the internet kind of nervous. But here is the thing, my friends. A lot of people on the internet seem to not realize or conveniently forget that the United States Air Force technically reached a 6th-gen milestone years before China's recent unveilings, with the Next Generation Air Dominance NGAD prototype flight back in 2020. This is arguably the exact same thing that China just did, a prototype flight. For those that do not remember this, the NGAD is something that prioritizes range, stealth, and advanced technologies, including adaptive engines and AI-enhanced sensors, enabling unmatched situational awareness and potentially unmanned team operations. We are talking about jets that are being developed by the United States that may not even need pilots. The United States has been working on this for years and arguably has been in a position that is more advanced than the Chinese. But there is a bit of a caveat that of course has to be mentioned, as I know this is going to appear in the comments section. While the NGAD is something that sets a very high standard for future air dominance, it is ludicrously expensive. The $300 million cost per unit is something that is a significant challenge. It is way over budget, the entire program is, which over the years has led to significant program delays. So yes, right now, defense media is going crazy about China's new and recently unveiled 6th-gen fighters. But the fact seems to have been lost that the United States military already hit that same milestone that they just did with a prototype flight years ago. And when I go and describe this, there's several things that need to be said specifically about the NGAD, like what its design purpose is, what it's supposed to include, etc. One of the central pillars of the design is an exceptionally long range, this being something that is necessitated by the vast distances of the Indo-Pacific. They need to be able to fly across the ocean. This, as you can imagine, would require exceptionally powerful engines, and the NGAD's engines are expected to generate significantly more electrical output than current propulsion systems, which would enable it to potentially power energy or laser weapons. Along with that, stealth is another vitally important factor of the NGAD program. While the F-22 is currently the stealthiest fighter in service that has been proven, the NGAD will be significantly more challenging to detect than the F-22. This being thanks to the fact that it, like what we have seen with the Chinese designs, is also a tailless design. It has newer stealth coatings and other advanced materials. Along with that, the NGAD will also likely incorporate measures to reduce its infrared signature by limiting engine exhaust temperatures. It is something that is going to reduce its overall visibility. At the same time, one of the truly revolutionary aspects of the NGAD program is supposed to be the jet's sensor suite, enhanced thanks to artificial intelligence, which over the years has seen vast advances. Harnessing AI will allow pilots to achieve unbelievable levels of situational awareness, and improve manned decision making as the AI is able to support them in real and rapid time. With these types of aircraft flying in tandem with other unmanned platforms and drones, the NG-80's potential to dominate opposing fighters is extremely high, as who knows what other kinds of support vessels could simultaneously be utilized. Now, my friends, when I go and describe these things, there is a lot of potential, yes. But at the same time that I am describing all of these really cool and amazing things, we need to understand that the NG-80 program has been years behind. Its development process began in the early 2010s under the Air Force's Air Superiority 2030 initiative. By 2020, which is, 5 years ago at this point that I'm making this in 2025, the Air Force's then chief, Will Roper, would announce that a full-scale demonstration had been flown. So, if the current timeline is something that remains true, if there aren't further delays, further budget issues, as this is something that is probably bound to happen, the NG-80 program is expected to achieve initial operational capability, IOC, sometime in the 2030s. It may not exactly be 2030 itself, which, was the initial plan, but maybe in the mid-2030s this is going to happen, when the F-22 Raptor will, at that point, be partially retired. There is, of course, one gigantic problem when I talk about all this, as I previously mentioned: cost. Look, my friends, the reality is that the program, though impressive, is on pause because it has a massive cost issue. The NG-80 fighter was expected to cost a massive $300 million per plane, with this cost potentially going up the more technology is put into it. And while the US Air Force is working on the issue, it looks as though, the Trump administration is going to need to figure out what exactly is going to need to happen with it once it is that he takes office. Because of these issues, that is why so many people are focusing quite hard on China. They are saying that China is making significant strides not only in military aviation, but also stealth technology, artificial intelligence, and other areas that will modernize their military technology, making it significantly more effective. And while the recent test flights of the new 6th gen fighters by China is impressive, it is something that has definitely caused a stir, we don't have any actual qualitative data that will show us what this really is. That is the reality that many people do not seem to understand. Trying to compare Chinese and American 6th generation fighters is just not possible. And so it is, my friends, that in the end, China might be narrowing the gap in its position behind the United States. We really can't tell, though. Yes, flying a test with a 6th gen aircraft is a huge achievement. It absolutely is. But we can't just say that the United States has lost the race in the generational aircraft arms race against China. That absolutely cannot be said because, once again, we do not have any actual data to show, and simultaneously the US was doing test flights years before the Chinese ever were. At this point, really only time will tell. Will there be more budget delays? Will there be more issues? Will a technology stopping point be hit? We don't really know. Again, only time will tell, and surely we will update you at that time if there is any other news. But besides that, there's not really much more that can be said. Anyway, my friends, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you very much for watching our, little analysis on generational aircraft and the buzz that has been going around. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Buy my merch if you'd like to support the channel. Make sure to check things out on Patreon if you want to support me further. And my friends, I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends.